Now, in terms of our theme for today, so the Lunch and Learn today is on the changing face of volunteering post-pandemic. And I'm very aware from the conversations that I have with our London churches and with a lot of charities of what I saw in Hannah's report, she called the triple whammy, which I thought was a great phrase. And that in terms of an increased demand in services, so a real increase in needs that we're seeing, but that faced with funding challenges and with reduced levels of volunteering. So it's some of those challenges around volunteering which we're going to focus on today. And we're absolutely delighted to have Hannah Rich here with us today. So Hannah has been writing for the last few months and researching, and has now just published a piece of research looking at the state of volunteering across the UK since the pandemic, which she's been doing commissioned by the charity Housing Justice, who are also one of our partner charities. She's a senior researcher at Theos think tank, which is the UK's largest religion and society think tank. And she's very kindly joined us today to share a little of her findings with us, and also to explore with us retaining and recruiting volunteers in this challenging post-pandemic context. So Hannah, thank you for your time. We're really pleased to have you with us. And we've also really pleased to have Reverend Donna Williams with us here today, who's from All Saints Hampton. And she's going to share some of her experience of recruiting and retaining volunteers from a parish context. So helping us reflect on what's worked, but also what hasn't worked. We want to be real about the challenges around this. So we're really grateful to you as well, Donna, for your time today. And so just in terms of structure, so we're going to hear from Hannah first, then we're going to hear from Reverend Donna, and we'd love if you could just be posting any questions that you have, that you've brought with you in the chat as we go, and we'll be kind of compiling those. And then after they've spoken, we're going to hopefully have a good sort of at least 10 minutes, hopefully even a bit more for questions and that we can ask to Reverend Donna and Hannah at the end. And then we're going to try and close really promptly at 2 p.m. Because I know some people have meetings that start promptly at that point. So I think that's all of the kind of introductory pieces. So Hannah, I'm going to hand over to you now. Hopefully your slides are brilliant, working, and thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks for having me today to share this work. It's really great to be presenting this report that only came out last week, so this is actually the first time it's been kind of presented publicly, I guess, which is really exciting. And it's exploring the changing landscape of volunteering in the UK and how the last few years and all of the turbulence that's gone with them has changed that. And unsurprisingly, the headline is that things have changed quite significantly, both at a kind of top level across the whole voluntary sector, but also going down to kind of specific contexts like faith groups and like the homelessness sector, which we use as a kind of case study in this report. And just to say, we're using that phrase after the pandemic quite kind of cautiously rather than after COVID, because obviously we know that COVID's not gone away, but the acute kind of pandemic phase has mainly. But it's also worth saying that as with most things, I think the ways that the pandemic has changed things and has changed us are still emerging and are obviously really tied up with the economic crisis that we came straight out of the pandemic into. So although we're after the pandemic, we're very much not after the kind of crisis phase. And actually one of the striking things throughout the research is quite how long charities, faith groups, voluntary organisations have been operating in crisis mode. It's over 3 years now for many of us. And so that's just worth kind of being aware of, I guess. So volunteering after the pandemic is mainly about situating where we are right now in 2023 with all the associated challenges and pressures on the sector. And it's based on a piece of research that we did earlier this year with Housing Justice, as Patty mentioned, focusing on volunteering in the homelessness sector. But the findings are relevant far more broadly than that, and I'll explain as we go along what is specific to homelessness, but what that might mean for the rest of us and for faith communities more generally. So we did a survey of volunteers across the Housing Justice network, as well as some paid staff, majority involved in delivering accommodation, but actually some of the findings resonate with far more broader volunteering contexts. And we did some interviews with individuals from right across the homelessness sector. Again, some paid, some volunteers. We did them mainly earlier this year. And then we looked as well, and as I go along, you'll see we contextualized it with existing data on volunteering more broadly. So there's some of the data is ours, some of the data is stuff that we've analysed from other sources, and we've kind of brought those together to kind of to make it more helpful, I suppose. So there's a lot that is applicable across the country and across the whole charity sector, not just to homelessness. And it was really important, we found, that bringing together the quantitative and the qualitative, so the stories and the statistics. And we found that both of those have changed, basically. So the quantitative nature of volunteering, the scale of it, the number of people involved, the levels that are going on has changed, and I'll go into how that's changed. But also the qualitative aspect of volunteering, so what it feels like, how it's experienced for volunteers, has also changed quite significantly. And both of those are as important, and both of those are things that we've seen nationally. So that's the methods bit out of the way. There's a lot more detail of the breakdown of that in the report if you're interested. But I'll move on to what we found, which I think is potentially the more interesting bit. So just as a headline, firstly, volunteering was already starting to decline before the pandemic. Levels of formal volunteering in particular had decreased since 2013, basically, or between 2013 and 2020. The proportion of the adult population volunteering at least once a year fell from 45% to 37%, and the number at least once a month went from 27 to 23. Informal volunteering, and I'll get into the difference between that in a second, remains slightly higher. So actually, although formal volunteering fell, some of the overall volunteering levels were sustained by informal volunteering. And that's certainly something that became even more acute during the pandemic. And that distinction between formal and informal is really important when we get into the pandemic. So just briefly, formal volunteering is in the context of an organisation, a church, a club, a charity, and informal volunteering is defined loosely as kind of unpaid help that you do individually outside of the organisational context. And obviously, when we saw at the start of the pandemic, most formal volunteering stopped pretty much overnight because all of those places shut. Informal volunteering went through the roof because we all started doing shopping for our neighbours, and those informal kind of mutual aid groups on our streets, which are classed as informal volunteering, sprung up overnight, didn't they? And yeah, this is, again, really worth noting that just before the pandemic, so the data here is for 2019, people aged 65 to 74 are twice as likely to volunteer as those aged 25 to 34. And I suspect we probably all know this. I think this is probably true, particularly of churches, maybe, dare I say it. But it's really crucial when we come to think about some of the challenges of the pandemic and how prepared or not prepared we were for that. And so the pandemic, as I said, the immediate impact was that pretty much overnight, formal volunteering plummeted, informal volunteering rocketed, and that was partly due to things shutting, people not being able to go out, and also due to the people that were involved. So the elderly, mainly older kind of cohort of volunteers, more likely to have to stop than some of their younger counterparts. And in the first month of the pandemic, or roughly the first month of the lockdown, 3 million people were involved in informal mutual aid groups, and most of those, not all of those, were already volunteering. And we also saw that the average age of volunteers dropped quite significantly during the pandemic. As I'll go into, that's not necessarily been sustained, but that was partly due to older people being more likely to not be involved. Also, people on furlough. Actually, one of the biggest factors during the pandemic was people on furlough taking up volunteering. And that's really interesting, I think, to bear in mind longer term, that it suggests that it wasn't due to a lack of will, that younger cohort weren't involved pre-pandemic, but more just the constraints of 9 to 5, not having time. And there's certainly things to think about in terms of the way we organise the working week, and we organise our volunteering around that going forward. But most of that wasn't actually sustained beyond the initial wave of the pandemic. So while in March we all got really excited about it, actually by kind of the second lockdown and the third, and as things went on quite a lot longer than we anticipated, not much of that was sustained. By the time the November 2020 lockdown happened, there was another contraction in formal volunteering. Some of the stuff that had opened up shut down again, but that time without the corresponding increase in informal volunteering. and previous volunteer experience largely remained the best indicator for sustained engagement. So if you were volunteering before the pandemic, you were still more likely to be volunteering at the end, regardless of what had happened in the middle. And notably, even when, I'll come on to that one in a minute, but notably, even when there was that drive for volunteers to support the vaccination rollout, quite a lot of people got involved in that in kind of autumn, winter 2020. 200,000 people signed up for that. Which sounds like a massive number until you compare it to the 750,000 who signed up to be NHS responders on the first kind of tranche of the pandemic. So 200,000, is still really significant. But I think it's interesting that even something as exciting and kind of transformative nationally as vaccination didn't have that same draw as the volunteering opportunities in the crisis response, the really acute crisis response phase in March. Even in that kind of that time, things had waned a little bit. And so the data suggests that there was a loss of 4 million monthly volunteers between 2019 and 2021. And that's bearing in mind even with some of the stuff that had opened up by the 2021-22 year. And I suspect some of that, we can't quite dig into that data in enough detail yet, but I suspect some of that is the economic crisis that people who might have returned didn't necessarily, because even though by 2021-22 things were slightly more normal, the economic stuff had started to impact on that. And actually, if you think, when we looked at night shelters as our case study, people in night shelters talk about winters in terms of seasons, and the last kind of normal winter or completely normal winter for that was 2018-2019. And so it's been a long time since things were completely normal, because even the back end of 2019-2020 was getting into the spring when we were starting to worry about whether things shut down. So it's been a long time since any of this felt normal, and there's been a huge amount of change in that time. And so what does this mean for how volunteering feels and how people involved in volunteering experience it? In a survey done by Pro Bono Economics, and we cite their full report in the report, and it's really interesting, lots of data there if you're interested in this stuff. But 63% of small charities cite volunteer recruitment as a major organisational concern. 1 in 3 found that the cost of living crisis is a specific issue for volunteer retention. So that's people kind of dropping out of the volunteer cohort because of cost of living or not being sure if they're able to keep up their commitments. 40% of charities, and that's of all sizes, say that a lack of volunteers has stopped them meeting their main objectives over the last year. And over a quarter of charities cite a lack of organisational capacity as a problem for recruiting and retaining volunteers. So there's not enough people or enough capacity to do the recruitment, which then in turn leads to not having enough capacity to do the stuff, which then means you haven't, it's a vicious cycle. And so some of these stats are not necessarily that encouraging, but I think they're helpful in the sense that if you're struggling with some of this stuff, particularly with recruitment and retention, you're very much not alone. This is something that's affecting the whole sector at the moment. And that's not just faith charities, that's kind of, charities of all shapes and sizes, of all different social causes right across the UK involved in that survey there. So this is from our own, this is some data from our own survey. We asked the volunteers in our survey how they would describe these various aspects of volunteer management compared to before the pandemic. The red sections are, the red and yellow sections, are harder or much harder. And then the sections on the left, the blue and the green, are easier, much easier. And the bit in the middle, the blue bit, is largely the same, although obviously the same as before the pandemic doesn't mean that nothing's happened in the last few years. It just means that by the time we asked this in spring this year, things have maybe settled down a little bit. And so you can't see the numbers on that. Again, these are in the report in a little bit more detail, but over half said that recruiting was harder now than before the pandemic, which was the biggest finding, I think, from this question. And over a quarter thought that retention was harder, and only 3% and 8% respectively said that these things were easier. So the general consensus is that things have got more difficult. In terms of training and supporting volunteers, this was a little bit more nuanced, I guess. More people thought these were easier than before the pandemic than thought it had got harder. And when we interrogated that a little bit more in the written questions and the interviews, this seemed to be because things like training meetings can be done on Zoom now. Obviously, it's a lot easier to engage the volunteers that you have in those things if they haven't got to come in person, or there's greater flexibility to it at least, but also because there's kind of fewer volunteers in some cases, so managing that training and supporting was the same, always kind of has become a little bit easier. And then that last one, meeting the needs of guests, 53% said that had got harder since before the pandemic. But despite the difficulties with volunteer capacity, 18% thought it was easier, including 6% who thought it was much easier. And they're small numbers still, 6%, 18%, but the comparative is interesting that it's not universal, that it's got harder across the board. And I think that some of the changes that have been affected and been kind of enforced in some ways through the pandemic, and again, particularly in night shelter provision, as we're about to go into, have been beneficial for the guests, beneficial for those that come and receive from these services. We also asked what the main challenges facing people in our survey were with respect to volunteering, and they were allowed to pick up to 3 from a list of options. So you can imagine this is like the world's worst game of family fortunes. We asked 40 people, what are the biggest challenges? And unsurprisingly, top was difficulty recruiting volunteers, in line with the data that I've already gone into from the sector more generally, followed by volunteers not coming back after lockdown, general lack of volunteer capacity, so not enough volunteers, and then fourthly, regular volunteers retiring. And we put this in as a separate option from not coming back after lockdown. And I think the fact that, over a third of people selected that in addition to or separate from not returning is quite illustrative of the age profile of volunteers, as we were saying. So some people just got out of the habit, didn't come back, but a significant proportion actively or kind of proactively retired, as opposed to just kind of stopping. Struggling to adapt to new models. Again, this is particularly apparent in the context of homelessness, where the models had changed quite a lot, and we'll unpack that a little bit later. And then short-term volunteers, so people struggling with having volunteers that don't want to commit to long periods of time. And as we'll get into, that might just be something that we need to get used to, and that's not necessarily a challenge that is going to go away. And then under the other category, sorry, page. No. And then under the other category, people talked about kind of the rising need, the fact that although they had the same volunteers as before, things had changed slightly. And so this just, again, to look at kind of some of the data about how volunteers experience volunteering. The data from NCVO, who do a lot of work on this, suggests a general fall in volunteer satisfaction in recent years. This all kind of echoed with stuff that we found through our work as well. 92% of volunteers still say that they're very or fairly satisfied, so that's pretty high, but that is down from 96% in 2018. And although that's not a massive change, it is still kind of the direction of change, I guess, is quite apparent. Nearly a quarter, and these are some of the reasons that NCVO suggest why this might be. Nearly a quarter felt that their organisation had unreasonable expectations of how much they did. And interestingly, volunteers are also more likely to think that their volunteering is becoming too much like paid work. So 26% of that said, 26% said that last year, up from 19% 4 years before. And again, that's not a huge change, but it's a significant one in terms of people. If what they volunteer for is that it's not like paid work and they feel like it's becoming more like paid work, then there's a clear impact there on retention, if not on recruitment. So this leads me on to discussing some of the findings from the interviews that are specific to night shelters, and we're focusing on that because that was what the majority of the work that we did was, but there's other contexts in the report, and I think that you'll be able to kind of hear stuff that resonates with your context even as I go into this, and I'm happy to take questions on how it applies more broadly afterwards. But first of all, there's been a significant degree of change to how those charities operate, catalysed by the pandemic, which has had large implications for volunteering patterns. This is a quote from someone in the research when we said, how did the pandemic affect your work? Absolutely everything about how we ran changed overnight. And that's not an exaggeration, as many of you will know. And again, that is true far more broadly than just that particular context. And specific to homelessness, this looked, as many of you will know, like a transition from communal night shelters to static ones. So where before the pandemic it went round the 7 churches in the circuit, sleeping in a communal space. Obviously during COVID, during the restrictions, that wasn't particularly helpful for public health, so it was moved to a static model, generally where individuals had their own room. and rather than sleeping in a communal space. And so that's a drastically different mode of engagement for volunteers. For the guests, that was described as a silver lining, so something that was actually a really beneficial change for the guests of the night shelters, having their own space, having their own room, but that's not always been reflected in the volunteer experience of it. Volunteers are a little bit more ambivalent about it. This is a really striking quote, I think, that while it's much better for people to sleep in a single room, the volunteers really don't like it. And we'll get into why that is. Partly that is because the connection to place matters. And I think this is particularly true for faith-based organisations, for churches, isn't it? That it's not just the fact that they volunteer with people from their congregation, but actually it mattered to volunteers in the night shelter context that it was their church hosting, before that on a Tuesday night they knew that St. John's or whatever it was hosted, and they could say that their church had done it. And so that commitment to place was really important to them, in a way that we might not have identified pre-pandemic. We might have said, people think it's great that the people of this church, or the community of this church, are involved and volunteer, but actually when it moved to being in a static location, some of that was lost, even if the people were the same. And the power dynamic is quite interesting, and this is something we dug into a little bit more in the report, but there's a real difference between inviting guests into your home, which is how people framed it in terms of inviting them into your church, and you going into theirs, which is what it feels a little bit more like when they're in a static place, they're living there all the week, and you as a volunteer are the person going in. And we heard about volunteers feeling uncomfortable with that. It's not the way things were before the pandemic. We heard anecdotes, for example, of volunteers feeling uncomfortable with the guests knowing more about where the pots and pans live and where the washing up liquid is kept, whereas actually when it's your church kitchen, you know it inside out. There's a sense of security there, and people really like that. And one observation to offer here in terms of how we think about volunteering more generally is that some of the language and the descriptions that volunteers use to describe their attachment to the old model, or to how things were pre-pandemic, isn't actually dissimilar to how we've also described the benefits of things like the warm spaces and the community spaces that kind of happened last winter, or the sense of belonging around church more generally, actually. So when we asked people what they liked about the old model, they said sort of relationship, that it was communal, that it was warm, that it was belonging, and seeing friends doing something together. And some of those were things that were lost or kind of changed a little bit in the pandemic. And I think that speaks to the reciprocity of it. So for volunteers, the fact that they actually do benefit from it in a social sense. And there's a whole conversation, I think, to have there about the tension between what is best for the guests and best for the people coming into whatever the social action project is, and the volunteers. Just briefly, we found that some of the reduction in volunteer numbers was actually organic, just by virtue of fewer being needed. So rather than several teams in each church, often not doing very many shifts per season, there's a more streamlined set of volunteer roles in a static shelter. No one's needed to blow up the airbeds every night, because that's not a job that's needed anymore. One interviewee talked about a volunteer pool that was 40% of the number it had been before the pandemic, which sounds quite drastic and quite terrible. And they acknowledged that to put that in a report to their trustees, for example, didn't immediately look like a good thing to say they had 40% of the volunteers they had previously, but some of that wasn't negative. Actually, that meant that all of the volunteers that were there felt needed and had really defined roles. And that might, again, seem like not necessarily seem obviously to be a good change, and I think there's something there for trustees reading those reports, seeing how things are reported, but also in terms of actually it's important that people do feel like they're coming regularly and like their contribution is valued. This also none of the changes that we've gone into were reasons in and of themselves for people to stop. They weren't that drastic or that terrible, but because of the urgency of the pandemic, they were experienced as such. So only one of the shelters, or two of the shelters, in the research have begun or considered the transition to a static model without the trigger of the pandemic. The majority said that, if it wasn't for the pandemic, they wouldn't have had to do so, they wouldn't have thought to do so. But actually many of them haven't gone back to the previous model because they've realised how good it is for the guests. But where it happened overnight, it it was experienced like a kind of a loss or a rupture, or actually even something as strong as a bereavement for volunteers, because it happened like literally overnight. If you were planning to do it, if you were a charity that were planning to introduce something, a change of that level, you'd do it over a year, you know, you'd bring the volunteers with you on the journey. And so I think that underlines the importance of when you're doing those changes, when, you know, when it's possible, bringing people with you. Obviously, hopefully we'll never be in a global pandemic again, and things will never have to be this urgent and drastic again. But where possible, bringing the volunteers with you, explaining why things are changing. People often don't like change, often are quite resistant to that, but if you bring them with you, but also recognising that in recruiting new volunteers, it's essentially an entirely different project before the pandemic, and the same is true of lots of our initiatives, that the recruitment strategies that worked pre-pandemic might not now, not because they don't work anymore, but actually because what you're recruiting to is completely different. So the people that might be interested in volunteering with things as they are now might not be the same group of people that you thought of pre-pandemic, but you might have to kind of shift how you recruit. And the final finding that we kind of want to highlight is about the need to remind people of the need to volunteer. It was felt particularly in the context of homelessness that the importance of that had been lost a little bit during the pandemic. There's a sense, I think, that people think that Everybody In initiative that happened at the start of the pandemic solved homelessness. And in the meantime, the number of kind of causes competing for volunteer involvement has gone up. We've seen Homes for Ukraine over last year, and that took a kind of a group of a bit of attention away from some of the homelessness work. So did the rising energy bills, rising food poverty. Obviously there's a whole range of different contexts and different causes that are really important, but reminding people that night shelters are there, and again, what that might look like in your context. It might be that people have just forgotten that you're there, that we're aware of you before the pandemic, and that's a kind of small level change, I think, but actually reminding people that the volunteers are needed, not assuming, I guess, that they're still aware of it just because we're in the, you know, we've been in this crisis phase for 3 years, and some people will have kind of drowned that out a little bit or drifted away from being aware of how acute it is. So some recommendations just to finish, and then you'll get to hear from Donna. So as it was apparent throughout the report, the current circumstances of like reduced volunteering, post-pandemic recovery and an economic crisis do make for a really difficult operating environment for voluntary organisations, for faith groups, for churches relying on volunteers. So there's a real need to kind of think about new strategies, new ways of recruiting, in addition to what it means to retain and support well the existing volunteers. Retention is really important. Retention is valuable, but it's also essential to think about new ways of drawing other people in. And pre-pandemic, many of those organisations, and I think churches were particularly, this was particularly true of churches, were reliant on long-term volunteers from within the congregation, to the point of sometimes having stopped having to actively recruit beyond their existing pool because they just hadn't needed to. If the same people have been involved for 10 or 15 years, then they hadn't needed to bring new people in. And so to a large extent, volunteer recruitment, though, has been quite circular. So we've seen the same volunteers moving between charities or between opportunities, or volunteering at multiple different organisations, as opposed to the emergence of brand new volunteers. And so active recruitment requires kind of looking beyond the usual suspects of the existing volunteer cohort. The reliance on existing volunteers has also led to that ageing pool of volunteers, particularly outside of larger cities. So this is less true, we found, of some of the projects in central London, but beyond that, much more true, which in turn led to a greater difficulty when this group were more severely affected by the pandemic. And so I think it's highlighted the need for the whole voluntary sector to find ways of broadening the volunteer demographic. It's never a bad thing to broaden out the range of people that are able to volunteer, and that will lead to kind of lowering the average age, which sets the sector in better stead going forward. And ways of doing that might be partnering with universities, student groups. One project that we interviewed had worked out ways of developing offers of placements for students, so social care placements, which counted towards their degree. And that's a kind of extreme example. That's not going to fit for everyone's context, but thinking of ways of doing that. And we also recognise that younger volunteers might be more likely to engage with flexible opportunities and shorter term commitments. So one volunteer coordinator talked about how they'd had a bigger number of younger volunteers recently, which was brilliant, but also they volunteered on average for 6 months at a time as a stepping stone towards employment or towards higher education. And that just requires a kind of change of mindset from valuing that longer term commitment. It does require a little bit more input at the start, and you're often having to recruit every 6 months, which feels like a challenge. But actually that shift in mindset means that younger people are better able to volunteer without coming in with the assumption that they'll be volunteering with you for the next 5 years, or for the entirety of their retirement, as has often been the kind of stereotypical engagement there, I guess. So a greater range of flexible, shorter term opportunities. And a clearer delineation of roles and responsibilities we found would also help attract new volunteers. So people like when they feel that they're volunteering in something specific, and they're able to bring their skills to that. And so that's kind of a good way of attracting new people as well as retaining the existing ones. And that might look like clear ways for people who are more practical to get involved. So one of the challenges we heard is in a lot of the night shelters, some of the stereotypical roles in that involve kind of talking to people and the really social side of it. There's a whole cohort of people who love that. There's a whole group of people whose skill set is better in terms of painting, or we heard one example of a joiner in a church congregation who was trying to find a way of getting involved, and really cleverly they found a way for him to get involved in building stuff for the night shelter. And again, that was really beneficial for everyone involved, meant that they had some stuff created for the shelter, meant that he was able to get involved, but he wouldn't have necessarily signed up to be a night shelter volunteer without that kind of, at the same time, clear delineation that he was able to get involved, but also that flexibility for it to not be just the talking to people part of it. Corporate volunteering, this is a really interesting one, I think. So there's been a rise of corporate interest, but it's often quite patchy. So I think coming off the back of the pandemic, quite a lot of larger businesses have wanted to get involved in volunteering. But actually it's more helpful if you can build those over the longer term. So longer term relationships with local businesses, and cultivate those opportunities for it to be sustained. And this is a recommendation for those businesses as much as it is for you guys. You probably know quite a lot of this, but it might be more beneficial for local charities, for churches, for someone to be given an hour a week, for example, by their boss, to invest in a mentoring relationship or in a longer term volunteering commitment over an 8-week period. So that's 8 hours, rather than to give 8 hours a day as a one-off. Often when volunteering is kind of done corporately, it's like we'll turn up for a whole day, do something and leave, and that creates more work sometimes for the charity, and also isn't necessarily sustained. But actually, to sustain volunteering over the long term, there's some kind of relationships that can be built there. And that, in addition, would allow you to kind of keep that base of people that join volunteering on furlough. So if they were able to have the flexibility to have a couple of hours of their working week put into volunteering, rather than it having to be 3 days at the end of the month, for example, then those people that got involved when they were on furlough and had the economic security to get involved and the time, might be able to kind of sustain some of those commitments, because the vast majority of people that did take up volunteering on furlough when they went back to work stopped. And that doesn't have to be the case, but with a bit more workaround. And lastly, just kind of a bit more investment of resources in volunteer recruitment. This will be true for some contexts, not for others, but just a kind of an encouragement that putting the time into recruiting people and doing it well, and supporting them through that does pay dividends, although it's often something that we don't have the capacity to do at the start, but that recognition that is there, and the need to raise public awareness of the cause, that might look different in some contexts than others. So certainly the people we were speaking to, that looked like reminding the population that there are still rough sleepers, there are still people experiencing homelessness, where there's the perception that hasn't happened, or that's gone away, but it might be recognising the need to remind your local community that you're still there, that their need is still there, when it might have waned if their engagement with it changed during the pandemic. Yeah, so that's kind of a run through of some of the recommendations, some of the findings, and again, I'm happy to take questions, but I'm really looking forward to hearing from Donna how that resonates with their context as well.
Super, thank you so much, Hannah. I've got lots of questions bubbling, as I'm sure others do. I've seen people have started asking them in the chat, so I do encourage you to post your questions in the chat, and then we'll try and get to as many as we can at the end. Also, we will share Hannah's report in our kind of post-event email, so you've got the full report, and she's also written a shorter blog on it. So just now to introduce Reverend Donna Williams. So she has been the vicar at All Saints Hampton for 2.5 years now, I believe. And they are a context that is very much a local parish church and very much wanting to remain a local parish church. They span across different traditions, so they have a number of different services on a Sunday, which span a range of worship styles. And one of my colleagues visited her a few months ago, and we just asked if she could come and share some of her experience of recruiting and retaining volunteers, both what's worked and also what hasn't worked. So we're really grateful for your time today, Donna. So over to you.
Thanks very much. I think the danger of following someone who's done research with lots of data is that you've only got me and my experience, and we've got some things right and some things wrong. No reflection on any age group or what's happening out there, just my experience here. So I guess I come from a different model of church. I come out of HTB, big church, always had big staffs where I am. I did 2 years of curacy, each in 2 different places, staff again. And I came to this church, which was mostly traditional, elderly, committed and faithful, but growing older, and during the pandemic. So I took it over in the pandemic. And so we had no money, we don't have lots of staff, and so we had to, we don't function without volunteers, really. So I was trying to think what I did in the beginning. I invested quite a lot of time in getting to know people, and I think the first thing I'd say is that just listen to, this is in church context, obviously, listen to what people have done in the past, what their passions are, what they can cope with now. So for me, those people had grown older in the pandemic, and Hannah had reflected on some of those things with the older people not wanting to volunteer because of health and things like that. So I think where I started was just listening and what they had done before, where they were excited about different things. And so if you think of where I came out of, lots of courses, lots of professional people, run a course, parenting, alpha, do all these things. And I looked at my lovely old people, and they are lovely and I love them a lot. And what they can do is bake cake. And they can care for people. So what we decided to do was open a community cafe, just as we came out. And so we did that fairly early on in my time here, and they run it in their way, and that's what they can cope with. They love caring for people, they love community, and they love baking. And so we started off just doing that, and we did it twice a month. So we met, we do once in the morning, because some people get up early and like mornings, and we do it on the third Thursday, we do it in the afternoon for those people who sleep later, find it very difficult to get up by 10 o'clock, and they at least have once a month in the afternoon then. And obviously there's some people that attend it all. So we started with their gifting. So we listened, we started with their gifting, and then I think for me, and I will sound critical, and in some ways I am being critical, the thing with volunteers is let them do it their way. And it may not necessarily have been my way, I can tell you sometimes, the one battle I had to slowly win was the tablecloths they used. And so, over time, more practical, more hygienic, more whatever. But the thing is, let them do it their way, serve in their way, do what they love and what they know. Because as soon as you try and bring in new things, which is the best intentions. So I'm not arguing that they're the best intentions, and maybe it's more modernized, and maybe it'll draw, we think it'll draw younger people, whatever we think, is that actually it wasn't about the tablecloths or even the quality of the cake, although I can recommend it, is that it was the love that they did everything with that draws the people here. And so what I learned as I watched them is I've never been in a church like this where I can honestly invite anyone to come to church and they will not be judged. They will be welcomed equally, and they won't be asked a whole lot of questions. They'll just be given cake and tea and someone to chat to and included in whatever's going on with what they're talking about. So listening, start with their gifting and grow something out of that, and let them do it and do that. And then I think fourthly, we're really passionate. Well, I'm really passionate about community. So I wanted parish church. I don't want big church. I don't want gathered church. I really want to be the vicar that walks around the streets and knows people, knows that even the people that don't come to church are going into hospital this week, and I can pop in while I'm visiting somewhere else. That kind of vicar really and ministry really resonates with me. So we started to build then community, and in churches I've been in before, and maybe it's right, it's there's certain, you've got to be a church leader, a church person to volunteer in different things. You've got to have a certain criteria that you've got to meet. This is not dismissing safeguarding, don't hear me on that. But what I love now is that quite a lot, we've got a whole garden team. Our gardens are beautiful. It's run by the church volunteers. A team of 12 volunteers do our gardens, and now a third of them are people from the community. They don't come to church, but if you ask them, they will say this is their church. And so I love the fact that we're now volunteering with community, and slowly, some of them have now joined the church because they've got to know the people, but that wasn't our intention. It was to be a church of the community here. And so building community and including community in our volunteering has worked for us. And sometimes, so we do children's activity afternoons as a church ministry, and we have community people helping. And there's no better evangelist than a child, I can tell you, as that. So, so I kind of relaxed my rules because I couldn't have all these criteria of, what your lifestyle had to be like and what qualifications you had to have. I just had to use what I had and encourage that. And then the fifth thing, which I think is probably of all of it, or it's two more things. The other thing is I realized I kind of have to be involved in everything. Now, I don't have to do, but as the leader of the church in this context, I have to attend the things. I have to get behind them. I don't have to be at every community cafe, for example, or every children's afternoon, but they have seen me through my 2.5 years be prepared to set up the tables, send them home and finish the tidying up, get behind them, encourage them, tell them the amazing job they're doing, speak to the people. So anything we do, I'm kind of present at, but not 100% of the time. So sometimes I've got meetings and I can't be at the cafe, but where I can, I invest myself in them. And I see that's the difference. One thing that just realized, one of my people wanted a bowling afternoon at the bowling club for lawn bowls. And so he said, can't we do it? I said, yeah, let's do it. You organize it. And so I stood up and said, look, come on, we're going to go out and have an afternoon doing bowls. You can play, you can come and have tea and coffee, you can do whatever, or you can laugh at the vicar. But we're all going down there. And we had in the end about, I think it was about 63 people that came. And then we moved on to the pub, and then we moved on to a curry with people that would never have normally done that. And I think it's not about me, and I'm not blowing my trumpet, but that many people wouldn't have come if I hadn't invested and got behind what those volunteers were wanting to do. And now they'll do another bowling afternoon because they all loved it. And from social prescribing perspective and all that, it will draw people out and they can go and do it. I don't need to be there every time. But I think I learned that if it's important to them, it needs to be important to me. Otherwise, they're doing it on the side, and then you don't get the traction to stick. And then the last thing, which is obvious, is to say thank you, is to just be grateful. I learned it through lockdown too. I took over on the day of lockdown, curacy in a new church, which was interesting. And I hand wrote to everybody on the electoral roll 3 times and built relationships with them in a way that you can't imagine when you can't meet people, right? We couldn't meet people. And so I'm a big advocate of a handwritten card, and even posting it, because to get it through the door that you've made the effort, and they've, just, so I don't do it all the time, but every now and again, someone will come to mind and I'll drop them a note or send them some flowers or whatever that looks like, bake some cookies, whatever that looks like, just valuing them. And we do a volunteers evening with smart canapes and drinks, and it's just a couple of us on staff. I do have 2 part-time staff now, just administratively and for events. And so the 3 of us do everything for that day, where the volunteers do nothing. And we just honor them, and honoring them through services and thanking and bringing focus to what they've done when we've done it. So those are the things I think have worked. I think the multi-generational thing is a key thing that we're really working on now. So my learnings are that everybody has something to give. I've got 3 99-year-olds in my congregation, and even they serve in some way. And I'll tell you who loves it the most, the 20s to 30s. And they do things together. And so this multi-generational thing, where I think the older people are much better at serving. I don't know whether it comes out of coming out of the war maybe, and not having, and maybe not working, and being able to do things together, building community is really important to them, and there's a lot to learn from them. And I find if you link the younger people with the older people and they build relationship, it's not like bring the younger person along, they've got to do the dishes with them. They go out and have coffee together, or they do something together, and that building of relationship, they really do things with each other now. So got a car boot sale, and one of the old people said to one of the young people, "Oh, don't you want to come and help me?" And because they know each other now, they're going to do the table together, and I think that's another thing. The other learning thing is we can say we're time poor, but we've always got time for things we're passionate about. And so building passion, honoring people, time poverty becomes, I'll invest what little time I have in that because it's important. I think the other thing, you have to ask people. Me standing up the front and saying we need people to help out at the light party doesn't get us anybody. Me seeing somebody talk to a child and say, look how good you are with children. Don't you want to come and sit and not make it too onerous on them, but just come and be part of it? And they will tend to respond to that. Giving people permission to say no. They can always say no. They rarely do. But if they know and trust that if they can't do it, they can say no, and I will still ask them or not be cross with them. It frees up people to generally say yes, because at some point they can say, I can't do this anymore because I want to do that, or I need to take a break. And I'm not going to get cross. Inside, I might think, oh, what am I going to do? But giving people permission to say no is freeing, and lets them do that. The other thing I will also say is don't be afraid to let things die. I just got a new ordinand, and she's going to start something. She said, well, what happens in 2 years' time when I go if we haven't got someone to take it over? And I was like, well, then we let it go. But we've done it for 2 years. Don't be afraid to let things go. Don't always think you have to do that same thing, because maybe the Lord's moving you to something else. I think my challenges specifically, as I haven't got lots of volunteers with professional skills. So I come out of corporate world before I got ordained. And I do a lot myself in terms of finance and fundraising and all that, because I just don't have the skills. And so it is finding people now in community that can help me, and even maybe not in my parish. And so you have to expand what you can look at. I think be careful if you do have staff, because staff can dictate how it should be done, and volunteers can step back and say you've got staff to do it. So your staff have to be supporting them, not doing it or telling them what they need to do. I think is a learning. There are 2 challenges I found within the church, not only in this church, is you have to remove the power bases. Anybody who it's my ministry, you do it my way, and squashes everyone else that doesn't allow volunteers to come up and serve cake in a different way or be part of the team, you need to kind of gently break it. And sometimes that means stepping them down and being bold to do that. But as soon as you get a power base, it will eventually strangle the ministry, and your volunteer base. The one thing I think we've been really bad at broader church, we've been really good at evangelism over the last decade or so. Alpha, Christianity Explored, whatever you do, we're going to get people in the church, we're going to baptize them. We don't realize they've gone out the back door, number one, but we also haven't discipled them. And so now we have a couple of generations now who don't know what it is to sacrificially serve and to get their reward, in inverted commas, out of just seeing the joy in others. We find quite a lot of the time it's about, I get nothing out of it, or I don't want to be doing the dishes, I want the upfront. There's something better that goes on over there, so I might help you, but then on the day say, oh, well, actually, I'm going out with my friends here. That whole, and I do think it's generational, and I think we're partly to blame because we've created it. I think also there's part of just society. I know there's a cost of living crisis, but generally we have more money than we had before, and things and experiences and all that are important. Whereas the older generation have this, I live for the other. And I think we need to re-breathe that in the church in somehow.
Just very quick, I'm just aware of time. I know Hannah has to leave very promptly at 2. So I just wonder if we can sort of move gently in a minute into questions. So
it's fine. I didn't have much more to say because I don't actually think the pandemic has made much difference. I just think we've had to start again and invest in people. The heart is still there, and we have to change. So the pandemic for me is gone. Our volunteer base is bigger than before, and we're doing loads in the community. So yeah, that's all I'll say.
Thank you, that's wonderful, and it's so helpful to have, I think, because we've got Hannah's research, actually to have that grounded in a real life, the nitty-gritty of actually what that looks like in a parish context is hugely helpful. And I've just been sort of following people's comments in the chat, and I think there's lots of really helpful things that people are taking away and engaging with, and resonating with their own context. So thank you so much, that was very, very helpful. I'm just going to hand over to Alison now, just so we can, there's a few questions I think that have come up in the chat, just so we can engage with those, and I think both Donna and Hannah are happy to respond to those.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for all the comments. It feels like we could do another conversation after this because there's lots of things that have been brought out. There's a couple of questions in the chat that was really interesting. I think there's one from Joe, who's talking about what extent we need to nurture congregations to see church as a community, and their volunteering being part of that community. And I think that's just what you were speaking to, Donna, that actually this is absolutely like core of who we are as disciples, and how that works with the tension of sort of giving volunteers needs and preferences and having a hobby. And is there a way that we could square that circle? Is that anything you found in your research, Hannah, with the with those who volunteer for the homeless shelters? And also, Donna, does that speak to you as well? Coming to you, Hannah, first, Hannah.
Yeah, I think definitely one of the thoughts I kind of have going forward from this research is how to make that more a part of volunteering in general. So it's not an accident, I think, that more people feel that it's like paid work, as it's maybe become less connected to community. And I wonder if the way to kind of resolve some of that tension is to bring it back together. But I think that use of the word hobby in the question is really interesting as well, because actually that's recognizing that for a lot of people that volunteer, they really enjoy it, and that's not a bad thing. It can't come at the expense of kind of continuing with stuff for longer, that it's really helpful for those that need it. I'm often struck from an interview that I did in a separate project a few years ago with a food bank volunteer who sort of said, obviously I want a world where food banks don't exist, but I don't know what I'd do on a Thursday afternoon if this place wasn't here. And actually the solution to that is community, and is connecting that person with community and relationship and somewhere to belong and have that social context. The solution to that isn't to keep on having food banks for longer than we need them economically, right? Or to maintain the conditions that mean that we need them. And I think that's where the kind of resonance with some of the warm spaces stuff comes in, that they're like spaces that people can come to. Doesn't really matter whether they're volunteers or guests. And that is what church is also at its best, right? And so I think there's, loads of thoughts there and loads of stuff that I'm still mulling over after the research, but.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's and Joe said it's not necessarily a hobby, but it's not a job. And I think I was really struck by.
I think hobby is quite like
hobbies. Yeah,
is the right word. I wasn't criticizing that in the question.
No.
Some people do see it like that, right? So they do for a week. It's
but I think with from the research that people were saying that they don't like it being like a job. Actually, that was really key. So, Donna, in terms of your experience of how do you square the balance between, I think you talked a little bit about discipleship, but also letting people do it the way they want to do it and what they want to do. There's a bit of a tension there.
Maybe in me. Yeah, I mean, I think letting people do it, as long as your objectives are clear and they've been part of defining those objectives and what we're trying to achieve. And so I always keep the big picture. We're bringing the love of Jesus, who we are reaching, who's at home on their own, who can we draw in, or taking people with me to the care home to see the need. And then they come up with the ideas and I'm like, yeah, I can jump on board with that idea. And so I do think as a leader, you have to be an undefended leader. It can't be about you. You can't be threatened. Somebody may do it better than you. And I know that's easily said, and we all know it, but I see quite a lot out of insecurity. That's when we want to control it. And actually letting them do it. And I always use this term, and you got to let it be messy. You got to let it be messy, and you got to catch the mess if they need you to catch the mess. And that's not always easy, because you could have done it better or even prevented the mess. But they learn through the mess. But also it does look at, and they say, well, if it's that messy, I can also help. I can be 99 and help, because I don't have to be 30 and energetic and do it that way. And also I think with the older people, not to take away what is theirs. We want the young people in church, and we replace everything that's gone before, and we displace them. And they actually, you know, young people don't mind if it's older, you know, as well, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. I think it is attention, isn't it? I'm not sure we have many more bits of questions, and apologies, the fire alarm's just gone off here. There was a very brief question, which I think might be for you, Cameron, just in terms of research from Steph, just about in terms of ethnicity and how that relates to the demographics around volunteering. Is there any stats around that? Is it something your report looked at, or, you know, how does this break down in terms of, you know, different?
It's not something we looked at in a huge amount of detail, partly because of the size. The size of the survey that we'd done, there wasn't enough to kind of break enough people involved in it to make that a fair thing to break down. But the NCVO data and the pro-economics data, there's some really interesting stuff in there. I can't quote it off the top of my head, but they've certainly tracked kind of ethnicity and volunteering in their data better than we did.
Brilliant, thank you. I know there's some, go on.
No, I was just going to say, there's a question down there about the live streaming.
Yeah,
yeah, just a quick one in terms of what we've done is every month we've done a social of different styles, different times of day, different demographic we're trying to reach. And we're known for those socials now. And people come to church because they want community. And the live stream, whilst the care homes use it, and the people isolated at home and the people maybe away use it, they come to church because they want the community. And so I'd say invest in community as much as you do in Jesus.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll hand back to Patty now, just to finish off.
Perfect, thanks, Alison. So I'm aware it is nearly 2, and we said we'd be punctual to finish at 2. Just so Hannah, if you do need to rush off, that's absolutely fine. And anyone, just in terms of sort of wrapping up, I mean, firstly, just a huge thank you both to Hannah and to Donna. I mean, there's just so much food for thought there, and things I'm sure people will continue to reflect on. If it's a conversation people want to continue, then do let us know that in the feedback. We did run something earlier this year on volunteering, and it does seem something which is really, you know, important right now. So do let us know that. We will send a follow-up email, so that will have in it the link to Hannah's report and some other resources around volunteering. We will also put the recording, a link to the recording in there. Do share that widely, and we'll also put that on our YouTube channel. So you can sign up. I think hopefully Alison might be able to put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat in a minute. And the best way to keep in touch with the work of our team is through our monthly newsletter. And we're going to put the link to that in the chat as well. And just finally, we really appreciate feedback. We really want to continue to improve the quality of what we're offering you. So if you did have time just for a few minutes there's literally, I think 4 or 5 very short questions. So if you could stay on and just fill those in, and equally say in there if you'd like some continued conversation around this volunteering piece, then we would, that would be the place where you could do that as well. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been brilliant to have so many of you here. Thank you again to our speakers, and wish you a really good rest of your afternoon. And hope your lunch, if you haven't, I know it's a tricky time to have it before or after, but if you haven't had it before, I wish you a good lunchtime following. Thanks ever so much.